Hi, I'm Carole Owens, and this is part 2 of a 2-part introduction to Stockbridge Updates. What is it? Why is it? What about it? In part 1, I told you about the first meeting we had when I presented the idea of a hyperlocal newspaper called Stockbridge Updates. I invited 16 people to my house, and I said, how about it? Are you interested in helping? And 15 people left. One person stayed. A couple days later, a second person contacted me and said, you really going to do a newspaper? And I said, yeah. And he said, I'm in. Now, I have a suggestion for you. If you're going to invite 16 to 20 people and only 2 are interested in your project, let them be Bob Jones and Patrick White.
Thank you, Carole.
Bob, you were one of the people at that first meeting who stayed. Tell me, why did you stay?
Well, I think, what was it, 2020?
January 2020.
January 2020, and of course, you know, the country was in an uproar. We had just gotten through 4 years of an administration that some people found difficult to deal with, and of course, all politics is local, as is said. And I just felt that Stockbridge, that the Berkshires, really needed a venue where local people really could understand what's going on. A venue where you not only had what was going on at the local transfer station, but also what's going on in the White House, what's going on in the State House in Boston. And what better way to do it than create a dialogue, a local dialogue, as to how it affects each of us locally. And I thought it was a brilliant idea. All credit due to you. And it's been 4 years, and I think you've done an outstanding job. You have more readers than I ever could have imagined. And I'm just glad to have been part of the beginning and to continue on as a board member, and happy to be here.
You're on my editorial board, and I know that one of the things that you're committed to is transparency. Absolutely. But being on the editorial board, I don't remember over a 4-year period any specific, possibly you do, but there were some pretty knotty things the editorial board had to deal with.
Yeah, well, first of all, the idea of forming an editorial board was also brilliant, and your motive, if I remember correctly, was absolutely wonderful, and that is, I need somebody. We need checks and balances. I need somebody to be my guide. I need to make sure that I know what I'm doing is straightforward and right. I'm looking for all perspectives on this. So, and that's what the editorial board does. We get together when needed, if there's a specific issue or a specific letter or something, anything that might affect the integrity of Stockbridge Updates. We have an editorial board meeting, and amazingly enough, we banter back and forth, all kinds of discourse, exchange of ideas. We all land in the same place.
Isn't that? It's amazing. Yeah. And I just can't thank you for sticking with Stockbridge Updates for all these years and for all you brought to the table.
It's a privilege. Thank you.
And I said that a couple days later, who in the world should call me but Patrick White, not only our current select board member, but take my word for it, our state representative very soon. But tell me, what encouraged you to call up and say, I want to be a part of this?
Well, I think when we first talked, I wasn't even on the select board yet, and I was running against incumbent, and frankly thought just get my name out there. And turned out to win, but I feel like I have newspaper in my bones. I was the editor of both the high school Mountain Maroon Reflections, and I was editor of my college paper too. Actually, elected as a sophomore, and at Boston College, and I want to echo what Bob said, the importance of local journalism. Yeah, you think back to going back 250 years, the importance of the micro newspapers in New England and beyond, was fundamental to a strong democracy. And I think that starts locally. And in today's age, the digital equivalent of that really echoes a lot of what the Berkshires is about, where a lot of these mills were paper mills, and this supported printed communication and written communication, and I think what you're doing with Stockbridge Updates is no different.
Yeah. And I know now that you're running for office, you're discussing a lot of issues with the people, and a couple of issues that Stockbridge Updates covered recently you might want to speak to, and Bob also. One is the PCBs and that cleanup in Lee, and the other is Stockbridge, West Stockbridge, and Great Barrington, and the proposed new school. So take any part of that and tell us all about it.
I'll put on a separate hat to do that. I've never been to an editorial board meeting that Carole's had. My role in Stockbridge Updates has been I have some skills. I did some startups in the internet space a while back, and one of the skills I have is as a coder and understanding how to produce visual communications. And really, I've been the production guy, so I've taken a back seat. And I see, so because of that role, I see Stockbridge Updates a couple hours before anybody else, but no sooner. And I think that so taking that hat off as production guy and putting on the hat as somebody who's covered by the news, I think that you're absolutely right. I think that certainly looking at issues great and small. Every one of our issues deals with it's like what's going on at the museum or at what did the planning board permit or whatever, but you've done a great job at also covering the big issues of our time, issues like housing and PCBs and the school system and many others. And I think that it's not just Carole who's doing the covering either. From the get-go, she created a space where anybody can contribute. All we got to do is pick up their digital pen in the form of a keyboard and submit something, and they can submit a letter or a perspective piece, a photograph, and I think that community aspect of this has been a really important part of it. It's a voice that's open to all.
Yeah, I think both you and Bob were making that point that we want to hear from everybody, and we like it to be a dialogue, the opening of a dialogue. And speaking of dialogues, it's a little bit about how the sausage is made. What Bob is talking about is editorial decisions. We don't print any personal attacks. Yeah. We don't, we have all kinds of ways of sorting out what goes into Stockbridge Updates and what doesn't, with the great help of Bob, who is our chair, and the other members of the editorial board. But the same is true with Patrick. You would be amazed the 635 production decisions you have to make. And Patrick sort of smooths over how good he is, but he's a genius at this coding business. And he taught me a great deal about what makes ease of reading. For example, we don't have any click-throughs. It's all right there. Just scroll down and keep reading. And that makes it so much easier for all of you. Now, what we're going to do twice a month is kind of read you an issue here on CTSB. And we're going to figure out a way, the brilliant people at CTSB are going to help me, and we're going to figure out a way that you can comment on what you heard and that you can be involved also. But let me give you an example. Let me turn to Bob. Bob, no one has been more steeped and more involved and educated about the whole PCB problem. Can you tell us briefly where we are now?
Well, we're in much better shape. When I say we, I mean not only the town of Lee, but the citizens that live in the river corridor. In 2020, the very beginning of 2020, we were broadsided, hit from behind, really, with the news that there was going to be yet another toxic waste dump in Berkshire County, specifically in the town of Lee. The decision was arrived at behind closed doors, without the knowledge or consent of the citizens in the river corridor, and it was the agreement was structured so that was the goal: keep people in the dark, and we'll be able to get this thing through. In 4.5 years, we've come a long way. We've gotten not only some changes to the agreement, but we now have a lawsuit. The town of Lee has a lawsuit against Monsanto and GE, specifically because they knowingly colluded and polluted our river, and I'm going to say our river. I mean, we the people who live here, remember, we the people own that river.
That's right.
You know, and we the people will own that river in perpetuity, and no single corporation and no government entity can change that. Mm-hmm. And that's the conversation that 2020 agreement brought us to. So we have more irons in the fire than we ever did in 4.5 years later. And quite frankly, I'm going to be cautiously optimistic that we can bring about change, and how we actually end up in the river. We don't want to kick the can down the road so that the next generation or the next 10 generations have to deal with the same problems that we have. We want our river not to be a liability, and GE made our river a liability. We want to make it the asset that it once was, and we've come a long way.
And Bob and I both kind of were elected after that agreement was signed,
yes.
And I feel like our job has been to try to clean up the cleanup. Really sort of being faced with this thing that that we're to sign an agreement before all the details are worked out, you lose all your leverage. It was kind of just, at a practical matter, just an insane approach to negotiation. It was, I think that my guess, I certainly wasn't in the room then, is that most of the folks involved in the process had never been through the process before, except for the players on the other side of the table who'd been through it many, many times before. And my sense was it was a process designed from the get-go to take advantage of that, lack of experience. And boy, we learned those lessons the hard way.
And lack of knowledge. And I just feel like had we had Stockbridge Updates up and running, and had we been able to make this known to the public and get more people in that room.
Yeah.
Because I think Patrick makes an excellent point. You had the very experienced people from General Electric, and you had a room full of volunteers.
Yeah. No, I think it. I don't know what their political leanings are, but I'm a Democrat, and I will say this: in 2017, the change in administrations, heralded in a more, a less environmental friendly and more corporate friendly regime, and with that, we got the change in the agreement where, to save a couple $100 million, General Electric was able to put a dump in Lee rather than clean it up and incinerate it somewhere out of state. And, I just point out that in the last year I checked, I think it was 2 years ago, General Electric's profits were $11 billion. $200 million is 2% of 1 year's profits. And to put a dump on top of an aquifer, to save 2% of your profits for 1 year just seems unconscionable to me. But
I couldn't agree more, Patrick. And to further confirm what you just said, GE in 2021 said they had an airline division, presumably airplane engines. And they sold that airline division in 2021 for $26 billion.
Yeah.
$26 billion. And they're going to be divided into 3 entities very, very shortly. And in the end, you're going to end up with a cleanup of the river. They're saying they're going to get 20% of the PCBs out of the river. What is that?
Yeah.
Okay, so for those who think that Lee or the people in the other towns not the select boards, but the people in those other towns who are concerned about this are simply concerned with keeping a dump out of Lee. That is not it. Mm-hmm. This whole thing is about not another toxic waste dump in Berkshire County. Let's not let happen again what already has happened in Pittsfield. Right. We all know that story. And let's come up with a way to remediate that river, to actually do something about these PCBs. Let's not bury them in a dump. Let's not cap them in the river where you can't even get to them after it's capped. We're just looking for a real conversation, something that's meaningful and not the illusion of a cleanup of the river. But let me just go about Stockbridge Updates and Patrick White. Stockbridge Updates is a news journal. Stockbridge Updates, you can tell the difference between a news article and an editorial. They're very, very clear about that. And that's not true of all the newspapers in this area. There are some that they have agendas, and you read an article and you go, this is not a news story, this is an editorial, but it's on the news page. You don't get that with Stockbridge Updates. Stockbridge Updates also ask questions. They pose questions. Why was this done behind closed doors? Why are you telling me that it's in litigation when it's not in litigation? Mm-hmm. These are questions, and all of a sudden there's a conversation. You have a few thousand people who read this thing, and all of a sudden it's a conversation in front of the post office. It's a conversation over dinner.
You always made that point.
Yeah. And it's true. And I also have to say, when this went down, the select board in Lee that signed this agreement, they're no longer in office, and we have a new select board now. But when our select board, the present select board, went to the other towns and asked for a dialogue, a conversation about the impacts of this agreement, we weren't asking to rescind the agreement. We were just asking for a conversation about the impacts of this agreement, because it really is an open-ended agreement. Would any of us, those of you at home, would any of us sign a contract that was pretty much blank? We'll fill in the details later. Just sign here. Mm-hmm. Well, that's what happened with 5 towns, including the town of Lee. Then the select board, they signed. Who would do that? It's pure madness. We asked for a dialogue with the other 4 towns. Only one select board member in any of those towns stood up and said, let's just have a conversation, and actually made the effort, called the other towns and said, let's just talk. And that was Patrick White. Yeah. Patrick White stood up for the people in the river corridor, for the people in the 5 Berkshire towns that are part of that agreement. And that's why I'm going to be supporting him as state rep.
Thank
you. Stockbridge Updates just wants to make sure that you're in the know, all of you. And there's a pushback. There are some people that don't want you to know. Mm-hmm. They would rather present you with a fait accompli and say, we'll accept thank yous. Mm-hmm. But I think that we like to be in the process, have a chance to say our piece. In order to do that, we have to know what's going on. And the one thing that always made me feel a little angry is when people would say, it's too complex for the people. It's too complex. It's not that simple. Well, by gosh, it can be made that simple. And I'm going to give you an example, and poor Patrick doesn't know I'm going to ask him this. Mm-hmm. But he can do it anyway. The state is suggesting a goal for how much solar energy and renewable energy we should have in the state. Mm-hmm. And I know that you know how complex that issue is, mm-hmm. specifically for Berkshire County. Mm-hmm. And if you'd please just tell the folks.
Well, I think the first thing we should acknowledge is that the planet has to move away from fossil fuels. We have to do that. They're talking about the impact of severe storms, talking about wholesale extinction of species of insects and plants and some animals. So we've got to move away from fossil fuels. And as always, though, it's sometimes harder to actually accomplish it than it is to talk about the aspiration of, yay, we all need to be net zero and green. So, I credit the governor with having an ambitious plan to get to, a zero carbon footprint by 2050, and a lot of that involves, wind and solar. Now, Paul Mark has done a good job of saying, let's prioritize first the placement of solar above things like parking lots and on roofs. Is it roofs or roofs? Roofs on roofs, not hooves. It's roofs. And other built environments, brownfields. But the reality is that you could put that on top of every single building and parking lot and only get a third of the way to the governor's goals in terms of green gigawatts. So,
tell us why.
Because it takes something. I heard one statistic, and that it takes several thousand acres of land per gigawatt, and I think we have to generate 23 new ones
per gigawatt.
And this is where it gets interesting because all of these issues are related. You look at the Berkshire economy since GE left and took with them the last 16,000 jobs that they had here, and moved them either south or overseas. You look at the impact on the Berkshires, and the Berkshires, leaders in the Berkshires did a wonderful job at building a tourism-driven economy because that was the low-hanging fruit. Now, so we were able to get at least the service jobs. My dad moved here in 1957 to work at GE, and my parents bought a house while they were in their 20s, and you could do that back then. That's getting harder now because we're missing that middle class. So, but to get back to solar. North Adams, Mike Canales, our town administrator, told the story about when he worked in North Adams about how they beat back a proposal to put 500 acres of solar on one of the sides of the mountain because they had local control. And it looks like the legislation is going to pass that removes local control from most of the siting decisions, especially around the very large installations. So I think that this is an opportunity for us to make the case for why resort communities are such an important designation, because frankly, the rural landscape and the rural beauty is especially important to a region which so heavily relies on tourism, and so we're going to have to deal with these nuanced issues and recognize the trade-offs inherent in some of these gains that we need to make.
See, it can be done. And both Patrick and Bob are excellent at explaining things that we all can understand. There's a trade-off between so many of the decisions we have to make. Do you want solar? Do you want open spaces? How do you get both? Do you want to clean up the river? Do you want to just put it in a hole in the ground somewhere else? Or is there a better plan? Stockbridge Updates is going to keep on top of all of this. Twice a month, on the 1st and the 15th, you're going to be able to find us reading an issue, telling you what's going on. Look for us. I'll have special guests. And I have to tell you one last story. So it was January 2020. I was all excited. I was going to start a hyperlocal newspaper. I invited 16 people to my house, and everybody walked out except Bob Jones. And as they were walking out, they were mumbling, "You're crazy. It's too much work. People don't read anymore." And here we are 4 years later. And somebody asked me, "Did you feel bad when everybody walked out?" And I want to tell you something. If Bob Jones is the last one sitting in the room, you have nothing to feel bad about. And if a day later Patrick White calls and says, "I'd like to be involved," it's a good day.
Can we add one thank you to this organization right here?
Absolutely.
CTSB. We're sitting in a room with about $100,000 worth of equipment that is paid for by a percentage of the cable subscriptions. And people are cutting the cord and getting rid of cable. It doesn't get paid for by internet or by streaming or by telephone. It gets paid for by cable. And we got to make sure, and one of my top priorities going to to Boston if I end up getting that job is to make sure that organizations like CTSB, which serve their communities throughout the state, are protected, because we can't see their revenues continue to decline as people move away from cable, because it is so critical. I mean, just Stockbridge. Stockbridge is one of 18 towns in this district, and just Stockbridge has what? 15, 20 Zoom meetings that these guys host every single month. Carole doesn't go to 15 or 20 meetings in person. It would be impossible. She's able to watch those meetings on Zoom that are recorded, and that is a critical link to transparency and keeping the public informed. And this organization right there, I celebrate them. They're underfunded, and they still do such a fantastic job.
And I absolutely, and I feel like CTSB and Stockbridge Updates and the 6 other hyper-local newspapers in South Berkshire are really all sisters.
That's right.
We're all trying to do the same thing. So join Stockbridge Updates bi-monthly. Tune in to CTSB and send them a thank you note every once in a while. And I personally thank Bob Jones and Patrick White.
Thank you, Carole.
Thank you, Carole.